April 7th, 1945. The East China Sea. 12:45 p.m. Alarms screamed across the vast steel decks of the largest battleship ever built, Yamato. Crewmen scrambled like ants, sweat slicking their faces as the ocean erupted in towering geysers from near misses. The sky was black with American aircraft, Corsairs, Helldivers, Avengers, dozens of them diving with banshee screams. Their bombs whistled as they fell, and the ship trembled with every impact, steel groaning under the strain. From her flanks, anti-aircraft guns roared, spitting streams of tracers that clawed toward the heavens. The smell of cordite and burning fuel choked the air. Gun crews shouted over the thunder, their hands blistered from loading shell after shell. And above it all, Yamato's great cannons thundered. Her 18 one-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, boomed like the voice of a god. The blast shook her entire frame, reverberating through bulkheads, rattling teeth in the skulls of her crew. Each shot hurled a 3,200-pound shell into the sky, desperate to swat down the swarms that circled like vultures. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss more epic history. On the starboard rail, a petty officer leaned close to his comrade. His voice was hoarse, almost a prayer. "She's too big to sink." His friend said nothing. He only stared at the horizon, where black plumes rose in the distance. But the ocean has no respect for size, and Yamato's legend, her promise of invincibility, was about to be tested in fire. But how did it come to this? To understand Yamato's final stand, we must go back to her beginning. It was 1934, when Japan tore up the treaties that had once shackled its navy. The Washington Naval Treaty, meant to limit warship construction, was abandoned. To the world, Japan smiled politely at peace conferences. In shipyards, hidden from foreign eyes, it sharpened its blade. That blade was Yamato. Her construction was a secret of national importance. At Kura Naval Arsenal, screens of bamboo and canvas hid the slipway from view. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Workers swore oaths of silence. Not even local fishermen were allowed near. What rose behind those screens was not a ship. It was a mountain, given engines. Yamato's hull stretched 862 feet, longer than 2 football fields. Her beam was so wide that some believed she would be unable to pass through the narrow straits of Japan's inland seas. Her armor was thicker than anything afloat, a belt of steel up to 16 inches, enough to shrug off the heaviest naval guns of the age. Her main battery, 9 monstrous 18 one-inch rifles, could fire shells the weight of small cars more than 25 miles. Each blast could level a city block. She was not simply a warship. She was a message that Japan would not bow to America's industrial might. On December 16th, 1941, as Pearl Harbor still smoldered, Yamato slid into service. The launch was hushed. There were no cheering crowds, no foreign journalists, only officials, engineers, and sailors sworn to secrecy. But within the fleet, whispers spread like wildfire. To serve aboard Yamato was to serve aboard a legend in the making. Sailors spoke of her corridors, so vast that some joked she was a city adrift. Others called her a floating palace, her mess halls filled with rice, miso soup, and pickled plums even as other ships rationed meager meals. Her officers walked polished passageways lined with brass. Her sailors bunked in spaces larger than anything they had known on smaller destroyers. And always, there was the sound of steel, the heartbeat of a leviathan. Young men who served on her would later recall the pride. It was like standing upon the back of a kami, one wrote in his diary. The sea itself bowed before her, but pride is a dangerous fuel. It blinds. It whispers invincibility where none exists. For all her steel and power, Yamato was a creature of another era. She had been conceived in the 1930s, when admirals believed great gun duels would decide the fate of nations. Battleship versus battleship, armor against shell. But by the time she slid into service, the world had changed. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes had proven at Pearl Harbor that aircraft, not guns, would dominate the seas. Yet Yamato's admirals clung to the old creed. They saw her as the iron shield of Japan, the vessel that could stand against any American battleship, in a duel and emerge triumphant. To them, she was the trump card, a weapon so powerful it must be kept hidden until the decisive battle came. So Yamato spent much of her early war career anchored, guarded, waiting. Her crew trained, her gunners practiced, her engines throbbed, against their moorings, eager to move. But she rarely sailed into danger. The men joked that she was the hotel, a fortress that stayed safe while others bled, pride mixed with frustration. They longed to test her power, to unleash her guns, yet they also feared what that test might reveal. For now, Yamato remained unchallenged. She was invincible in theory, her great cannons unblooded, her decks unscarred. But beyond the horizon, America was stirring. Its shipyards thundered with activity. Carriers, destroyers, submarines poured from assembly lines faster than Japan could count them. Yamato might have been a titan, but across the Pacific, an entire pantheon of steel was awakening. The crew of Yamato didn't know it yet, but the day would come when their floating mountain would be forced to move. And when she moved, the ocean would rise to meet her with fire. The pride of Japan had been born. But pride is only the beginning. The question was never whether Yamato could be built. It was whether Yamato could survive the world she was born into. But for all her size, her armor, her thunderous guns, Yamato carried a weakness hidden deep within her steel. A flaw born not of engineering, but of time itself. The sea remembers. When Yamato slid from her secret dockyards into open water, she carried with her a promise whispered across Japan. No weapon built by man can sink her. But legends are born from steel, not whispers. And inside Yamato's vast hull lay the truth of her so-called invincibility. Step aboard Yamato. The first thing that strikes you is scale. Passageways stretch on endlessly. Compartments echo with the clang of boots against steel floors. For a young sailor reporting aboard for the first time, it felt less like boarding a warship and more like entering a city adrift at sea. Her armor was her soul. A belt of steel up to 16 inches thick wrapped her flanks. Above that, sloped plates protected her vitals, the magazines, the engines, the heart of the Leviathan. Her deck was clad in layers of steel and teak, designed to shrug off the heaviest aerial bombs of the era. Sailors joked you could fire a cannon at her side, and the shell would bounce like a stone across water. To them, Yamato was not just protection. She was invulnerability made flesh. But the true symbol of her power loomed above. Her guns, 9 of them, each an 18. 1-inch giant, the largest naval rifles ever forged. To load one shell took a ballet of men and machinery. Hydraulic rams hissed. Powder bags, each taller than a man, slid into chambers. Then the shell itself, 3,200 pounds of steel, an explosive as heavy as a small car, was pushed into place. When fired, the ship convulsed. The blast could shatter windows miles away. Crew members described the sensation as standing inside a thunderclap, their eardrums ringing for minutes after. The shockwave rolled across the sea, flattening waves, rattling the teeth of men standing watch. Each gun could hurl its projectile 26 miles, so far that the gunners sometimes had to calculate the curvature of the earth itself. To the Japanese Navy, these cannons were not weapons, they were judgment. They believed no American battleship could withstand even a single salvo. And in that belief, Yamato earned her title, the Unsinkable. But Yamato was more than her. Guns. She bristled with dozens of smaller weapons, 6-inch secondaries, anti-aircraft batteries, and, as the war dragged on, an ever-growing forest of 25mm machine guns. By 1945, sailors joked you couldn't walk 10 paces on her deck without tripping over a gun barrel. Her engines churned deep below the waterline. 4 propellers, each 20 feet across, drove her to speeds over 27 knots, astonishing for a ship displacing 72,000 tons fully loaded. The vibration was constant, a deep animal growl that resonated through bulkheads day and night. If you're with me so far, tell me in the comments, what's your country's name? Her crew numbered nearly 3,000. Within her steel labyrinth, they lived a life apart from the rest of Japan. Mess halls served rice, miso, and pickled vegetables, even as civilians on shore faced rationing and hunger. To serve on Yamato was considered both privilege and burden. A posting to a ship revered like a shrine, yet shrouded in secrecy. One sailor remembered. She was like a floating temple. We polished her brass until it gleamed, even as our brothers starved. We believed she could not be killed. But invincibility is always an illusion. Even as Yamato's hull gleamed under the sun, cracks appeared, not in her steel, but in the assumptions of those who built her. Her armor was designed to stop shells from enemy battleships, yet by the time she sailed, battleships were already fading into irrelevance. Aircraft carriers had changed the world. No matter how thick her belt, Yamato could not armor the sky. Bombs fell from above, torpedoes raced from below. Against aircraft swarms, her steel was a shield riddled with gaps. Her guns were colossal, yes, but they were slow. Firing once every 90 seconds, they were weapons of set-piece duels, not the rapid chaos of modern naval war. And their accuracy at extreme ranges, despite all the mathematics, was as much prayer as science. Worst of all was her hunger. Yamato devoured fuel at a monstrous rate, tons every hour. By 1944, Japan was starving for oil. To sail her was to gamble with the nation's dwindling reserves. She was a mountain of steel built for an age that no longer existed. Yet inside her, life went on. Crewmen drilled endlessly, sweating as they manned their guns, rehearsed damage control, memorized escape routes through the steel maze. When not on duty, they played Go, read poetry, or wrote letters never sent. Some carved their names into bulkheads, tiny marks on an ocean of armor, as if to remind history they were there. At night, hammocks swayed with the rhythm of the sea. The smell of oil and steel lingered everywhere. Sailors often spoke of the silence, the deep, oppressive silence when the engines cut for drills. In that moment, Yamato felt less like a ship and more like a living thing holding its breath. Superstitions thrived. Some believed her guns were cursed, so powerful they invited divine jealousy. Others whispered that no ship so mighty could survive, that her size alone would draw doom. The contradiction haunted her, pride and dread, reverence and fear. For all her power, Yamato rarely left safe waters in her early career. Admirals called her their secret weapon. They imagined her revealed at the decisive moment when Japan's fleet would clash with America's in one apocalyptic duel. So she waited, anchored, polished, admired, but untested. To her crew, this waiting gnawed at pride. They drilled, they ate, they polished brass. But they did not fight. They watched other ships sail into glory or destruction, while Yamato sat immovable, as if Japan feared to risk her. One officer confided to his diary, "We are like samurai locked in a castle, polishing swords that never leave their scabbards." Japan had built a fortress at sea, but a fortress, no matter how strong, is useless if the battle moves beyond its walls. The Americans were already proving that carriers, not battleships, ruled the oceans. At Coral Sea, at Midway, steel titans never even saw one another. Planes fought in their place, and battleships were left to watch helplessly. Yamato's crew, full of pride, clung to the myth. They believed her armor would hold, her guns would crush. But across the Pacific, a new reality was dawning, one Yamato's creators had never imagined. The giant was powerful, yes, but she was also vulnerable in ways no steel could fix. Her anatomy was unmatched, her armor thicker than a fortress wall, her guns louder than thunder itself. But anatomy is not destiny. And when the moment came to unleash Yamato, her size and power would not be enough. The sea does not care for legends. Yamato's crew had polished her brass until it gleamed, drilled until their hands blistered, and whispered in mess halls about her invincibility. But whispers do not stop bullets. And by 1942, whispers were all Japan had left. For months after Pearl Harbor, Yamato lingered in safe waters, anchored, guarded, admired. She was the jewel of the fleet, too precious to risk. Her guns had not fired a single round in anger. Her sailors grew restless. They were warriors without, a battlefield locked inside a fortress that never left its harbor. One midshipman recalled, "We trained as though we would fight tomorrow, yet every tomorrow came and we stayed moored. Yamato was a temple, but we were priests without a god." Then came June 1942. Midway. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk in a single afternoon, their decks turned into burning funeral pyres. The heart of the Imperial Navy was ripped out, and with it, the illusion of dominance. Suddenly, Yamato was no longer too precious to risk. She was all Japan had left. On February 12, 1942, even before Midway, Yamato had been named flagship of the combined fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself made her his throne at sea. From her bridge, he directed the vast sweep of Japan's early war victories. Coral, sea, the Indian Ocean raids, and then Midway where fate turned against him. Admiral Yamamoto paced Yamato's steel corridors in silence after the disaster. Some sailors claimed he looked older overnight. Others whispered that the ship herself seemed heavier, as though burdened with grief. Her invincibility had not been tested. But the empire she served had been wounded beyond healing. For the next 2 years, Yamato waited. She sailed occasionally with the fleet, escorted convoys, shifted between anchorages, but she never met her equal in battle. It was not cowardice. It was calculation. Japan's fuel reserves dwindled. Every voyage devoured precious oil, and every day America grew stronger. The High Command clung to Yamato as their hidden blade, saving her for the mythical, decisive battle that would never come. The crew grew restless again. They watched carriers take center stage while their giant ships stood in the wings. The joke returned. Yamato is the world's largest hotel. One officer wrote bitterly, "She is the sharpest sword in the empire, and we leave her rusting in the scabbard." But war has a cruel sense of timing. By late 1943, the Americans were coming. Island by island, they closed the noose. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam. Each defeat dragged Yamato closer to the front. It was October 1944 when Yamato finally tasted the war she had been built for, the place, Leyte Gulf, the moment, the largest naval battle in history. Japan hurled its fleet into the fight, desperate to smash the American landings in the Philippines. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, everything that could still float was thrown into the storm. And Yamato sailed at the heart of it. The night. Before battle, her crew lay awake in hammocks, listening to the hum of the engines. Some wrote farewell letters, sealing them in envelopes they knew might never be delivered. Others prayed quietly, clutching talismans. One petty officer polished his rifle until his hands shook, whispering, "Tomorrow we prove she is invincible." At dawn, Yamato's guns spoke. Her 18-inch rifles roared for the first time in combat, spitting fire and thunder into the sky. The shockwave rolled across her decks, rattling helmets, shaking bulkheads. Shells the size of automobiles arced through the heavens and came crashing down among American escorts. Sailors on destroyers miles away remembered the sound. A low, monstrous boom that seemed to split the air itself. One US officer muttered, "God help whatever those are aimed at." At the Battle off Samar, Yamato finally closed with her prey. Before her lay Taffy 3, a small group of American escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts. They were tiny compared to Yamato. Fragile wooden decks, thin armor, almost laughable before her giant guns. One salvo could erase them, and for a moment, The dream of Japan's decisive battle seemed within reach. But dreams are fragile things. The Americans did not run. Tiny destroyers charged headlong into Yamato's line, laying smoke, firing torpedoes, clawing desperately at the giant with weapons far too small to kill her. Planes from the escort carriers swooped in, dropping bombs and torpedoes until the sea boiled with explosions. Amid the chaos, Yamato fired and missed. Her great guns, so powerful, proved clumsy against agile targets. Her shells splashed into empty sea, throwing up geysers but striking nothing. Meanwhile, American torpedoes came closer. Bombs rained from the sky. Every minute Yamato remained engaged, she risked being swarmed and sunk. Her admiral, fearing annihilation, turned away. The giant retreated. When the order came to withdraw, silence fell across Yamato's decks. Men stared at one another, unable to believe. They had fired their thunder, unleashed their power, and accomplished nothing. The small American ships lived. The landing at Leyte continued. One sailor later recalled, "We returned with full magazines and empty hearts. We had faced our destiny and turned away." Others were more blunt. The great Yamato was humiliated by wooden deck carriers and tin can destroyers. Invincible? No. She had fired, and the war had not changed. From Leyte onward, Yamato was no longer a secret blade. She was a wounded myth. The Americans had seen her, measured her, and found her less than the legend promised. Her great guns could devastate, but they were too slow, too clumsy, too few. Her armor could deflect shells, but not the endless swarm of aircraft that now ruled the seas. Her crew still marched with pride. They still polished her brass. But deep inside, they knew. The decisive battle had passed, and Yamato had not been decisive. And yet, her story was not finished. Japan would call upon her once more, not as a symbol of invincibility, but as a sacrifice. The world's greatest battleship had survived her first battles, but survival was not victory. April 6, 1945. Night fell over the inland sea, and with it came silence heavy as steel. On the decks of Yamato, Japan's last great hope, 3,000 sailors stood beneath a sky scattered with stars. Some smoked in the shadows, hands trembling. Others sat cross-legged, heads bowed over paper, writing what would be their final letters. For every man aboard knew the truth. This was not a mission. It was a death sentence. Operation Tengo. The plan was brutally simple. Yamato, the world's largest battleship, would sail south toward Okinawa, alone except for a small escort. Her task was not to win, but to die. She was to beach herself on the island's shores and become an unsinkable fortress, her giant guns firing until American aircraft reduced her to molten steel. Fuel. She had just enough for a one-way trip. Ammunition? Full magazines, every shell ready. Strategy? None worth naming. This was a gesture, not a tactic, a sacrifice carved in steel. In Tokyo, admirals cloaked the order in rhetoric. Yamato would show the spirit of Japan, inspire the nation, frighten the invader. But to the sailors who read their sealed orders, it meant something simpler. You will not return. The mood on Yamato was strange that night. Some men laughed loudly, forcing cheer they didn't feel. Others whispered prayers, clutched amulets, tucked photos of wives and children into their tunics. In mess halls, sake flowed more freely than usual. Commanders allowed it, perhaps knowing this was the crew's last chance to feel human. A petty officer remembered one scene vividly. A boy sat beside me, barely 18. He had his mother's picture in his pocket. He smiled as he poured me a drink and said, "We are lucky, senpai. We get to die on Yamato." His hands shook the whole time. Above them, the ship's guns loomed in silence. Barrels pointed skyward like monuments. Below, the engines throbbed, churning fuel that could not carry them home. Yamato herself seemed to groan. She was not built to be a martyr, yet the men aboard her had no choice. At first light on April 7th, Yamato slipped her moorings and headed south. Her escorts steamed in tight formation. A few destroyers, a light cruiser. Nothing compared to the armadas that once sailed beside her. The sea stretched endlessly, quiet except for the churn of propellers. On deck, sailors shielded their eyes against the morning sun. For some, it felt like any other voyage. For most, every wave whispered finality. In Tokyo, staff officers listened for reports, knowing what was to come. In Okinawa, American radar already pulsed across the skies. Somewhere overhead, reconnaissance. Planes tracked Yamato's progress, relaying her position back to waiting carriers. The trap was set. By noon, the horizon darkened with movement, not storm clouds. Aircraft, dozens, then hundreds. American carrier pilots, briefed with one order, sink Yamato, roared toward their target. Torpedo bombers skimmed low, fighters weaved above them, dive bombers glinted in the sun. On Yamato's bridge, lookouts screamed bearings, officers barked orders. Alarm bells shrieked across her decks. Men sprinted to stations, slamming ammunition into breaches, cranking elevation wheels, sighting targets. The great ship awoke. The first wave struck like a hammer. Dive bombers screamed down, their engines shrieking as bombs tore through the sky. Explosions thundered across Yamato's decks, hurling men from their posts. Flames burst from her superstructure. Smoke poured upward, black and oily, choking the air. Then came the torpedoes. Sleek silver shapes streaked beneath the waves, closing in from every side. Yamato twisted, her massive hull groaning as the helm turned hard over. But size is not. Agility. The first torpedo slammed into her flank with a roar that shook compartments like an earthquake. Steel buckled. Water poured in. Sailors below decks screamed as lights flickered, pipes burst, and compartments flooded in seconds. Some never made it out. Above, anti-aircraft guns rattled furiously, tracers clawing at the sky. American planes fell, some disintegrating into fireballs, others splashing into the sea. The crew cheered briefly at each kill. But for every plane that fell, 10 more pressed the attack. Wave after wave descended. Bombs tore through Yamato's decks, blasting craters into her steel. Fire spread unchecked. Men rushed with hoses, foam sprayers, buckets, anything. But every explosion created more chaos. Torpedoes struck again. 1, 2, 3 more hits. Water surged into her belly, flooding boiler rooms, drowning engines. The list grew worse with each strike. The great ship leaned, her deck tilting, guns struggling to track targets as angles shifted. Inside, sailors clawed through smoke-filled corridors, dragging wounded comrades, choking on fumes. The air grew hot, heavy with burning oil. Some whispered, prayers into the darkness. Others simply screamed. On the bridge, officers fought to maintain order. But the truth was plain. Yamato was dying. By mid-afternoon, she was a wreck. Her great guns, those titanic 18-inch rifles, still roared defiantly. But fewer now, as ammunition hoists jammed and crews were torn apart. Her anti-aircraft batteries still spat tracers into the sky, though many were silenced by direct hits. She listed heavily to port, water pouring through ragged holes in her hull. Pumps could not keep up. Fires raged unchecked. Admiral Ito, commanding the mission, stood silently on the bridge. He had known this was a suicide run. Now, watching his proud ship unravel, he turned to his staff and gave his final order. All hands, abandon ship. It was too late. At 2:20 p.m., another wave of torpedoes struck home. The list became irreversible. Yamato heaved, her massive hull rolling onto her side. Men tumbled into the sea, screaming as debris and flames rained around them. Inside the ship, compartments filled with water, trapping hundreds. Some pounded on sealed hatches until the sea silenced them. Then, at 2:23 p.m., Yamato's forward magazines ignited. The explosion split the ocean. A plume of fire and smoke rose more than 3 miles into the sky, visible from Kyushu, 200 miles away. Witnesses said it looked as though the sun itself had exploded. When the smoke cleared, Yamato was gone. Only oil, wreckage, and thousands of men struggling in the waves remained. Most would never be rescued. American destroyers plucked a handful from the sea. The rest slipped beneath the waves, swallowed by the ocean that had once carried their pride. Of Yamato's crew, nearly 3,000, only about 270 survived. The rest went down with their ship, entombed in steel. Japan had sacrificed its greatest warship in a gesture of desperation. The Americans had answered with overwhelming force, proving once more that size and steel meant nothing against the sky. For survivors pulled from the water, memories burned deeper than wounds. One sailor whispered, barely alive, "We believed she could not be sunk, but belief does not stop fire." The death of Yamato was not just the end of a ship. It was the end of an idea, the belief that spirit and steel could defy the tide of history. But her story did not vanish beneath the waves, and how the myth of Yamato grew larger in memory than she ever had been in life. If you're enjoying the story so far, tell me in the comments what you like most, and make sure to subscribe. The sky above the East China Sea still carried the scar. Long after Yamato vanished beneath the waves, the towering column of smoke hung in the air, a black funeral banner visible for hundreds of miles. On the shores of Kyushu, fishermen looked up and whispered to each other, "Something terrible has happened." They did not know yet, but Japan would soon feel the weight of truth. News of Yamato's loss spread quietly, almost shamefully, through naval command. No triumphant announcement, no heroic communique. Just silence, broken only by whispered reports and casualty lists. In Tokyo, senior officers bowed their heads when the telegram arrived. Yamato, lost with nearly all hands, April 7th, 1945. Some could scarcely believe it. The ship that embodied the very soul of the Navy, the floating fortress built to protect the Empire, had lasted only a few hours under American skies. To the public, the news was softened. Radio broadcasts spoke vaguely of Yamato's glorious sacrifice. Newspapers used words like honor and duty. The truth, that she had been overwhelmed and destroyed before firing a meaningful shot at Okinawa, was buried. But sailors knew, and their silence carried more weight than propaganda ever could. Of the nearly 3,000 men who had sailed on Yamato, fewer than 300 returned. They came ashore in Kyushu dazed, their uniforms soaked with oil, their bodies burned, their eyes hollow. Villagers brought them rice, water, blankets. Some wept as they listened to the fragments of story these men carried. One survivor recalled watching his ship roll onto her side. "I saw men sliding down the deck, screaming as they fell into the sea. I swam until my arms failed. When I looked back, Yamato was gone." Another described the final explosion. "It was like the sky itself split open. The blast threw me into the water. When I surfaced, there was nothing left. No ship, no comrades, only fire on the waves." These men carried nightmares the rest of their lives. Survivors were sometimes treated with suspicion, even disdain. Why had they lived when so many had not? Their very survival was a wound. For ordinary Japanese citizens, Yamato's end symbolized more than a lost ship. It was the shattering of an illusion. Since her launch, Yamato had been wrapped in secrecy, myth, and pride. She was supposed to be the Empire's shield, a vessel too mighty to sink. Her name, Yamato, was itself a poetic word for Japan. To say Yamato was gone was, in a sense, to say Japan was gone. In the streets of Tokyo, whispers spread. If Yamato could not survive, what hope do we have? Mothers clutched, children tighter. Old men shook their heads in silence, and in the heart of the Navy, despair deepened. Officers had spoken for years about the decisive battle, the one moment when Japan's steel and spirit would overturn American numbers, but Yamato's sacrifice proved the opposite. There would be no miracle. The age of battleships was over. The war was lost. In the weeks after her sinking, Yamato's story grew stranger. The government turned her into legend. Posters and speeches framed her as a martyr, a warrior who had died for the nation. School children were told to honor her sacrifice. Newspapers compared her to samurai of old who charged into hopeless battles with honor on their side. But beneath the surface, bitterness simmered. Sailors asked why she had been sent at all. Why throw away the greatest battleship ever built in a one-way mission with no chance of victory? One naval officer put it bluntly. Yamato was not sacrificed for strategy. She was sacrificed for pride. In the years that followed, Yamato became more than a ship. She became a canvas on which Japan painted its grief. For some, she was a symbol of bravery, the last roar of a nation fighting to the end. For others, she was a symbol of futility, a monument to wasted steel, wasted men, wasted hope. Historians would later debate her meaning. Was Yamato proof that Japan's leaders had lost all sense of reality, sending a giant to die in a war already lost? Or was she the inevitable end of an age when navies believed battleships were gods of war? For the men who built her, the answer was bitter. One engineer who had worked on her hull confessed after the war, "We built her to protect Japan. Instead, we built her to burn." After 1945, Yamato slipped beneath the sea, not only as wreckage, but as memory. In novels, films, and eventually anime, she was reborn. Sometimes as tragedy, sometimes as hero, always as a vessel too great to ignore. Her name became shorthand for both the pride and the folly of Japan's war. School children learned poems about her. Veterans lit incense for her dead each April. Divers dreamed of finding her wreck, lying broken on the seabed like a sunken cathedral. Even today, when Japanese speak of Yamato, they do not mean only a ship. They mean a nation's spirit, majestic, defiant, doomed. Yamato's death was not the end of her story. It was the end of an era. But across the Pacific, her sinking carried a different meaning. For the Americans who watched her die, Yamato was not a martyr. She was a monster finally slain. April 7th, 1945. From the cockpits of US Navy carrier planes, Yamato did not look like a ship. She looked like an island, a moving fortress of steel, throwing shadows across the sea. Pilots would later admit that even from thousands of feet above, the sight of her stirred something primal, awe, fear, excitement. They had read intelligence briefings. They knew the statistics. 70,000 tons of displacement, armor thicker than any bomb could easily penetrate, guns the size of freight trains. But numbers meant little compared to the reality of watching the beast churn through the East China Sea. One American pilot whispered over the radio, "God Almighty, look at the size of her." That morning, aboard US carriers, the orders had been brutally clear. Yamato must not reach Okinawa. Admiral Raymond Spruance's staff had no illusions. If the battleship beached herself, her giant guns could shell. American landing forces for days, perhaps weeks, turning Okinawa into a slaughterhouse, so the carriers unleashed hell. Hundreds of planes were fueled, armed, and launched into the sky. Avengers carrying torpedoes, Helldivers loaded with armor-piercing bombs, Corsairs and Hellcats ready to strafe. It was to be one of the largest aerial strikes of the Pacific, war. And the target was a single ship. From altitude, the American pilots dove into a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Tracer rounds clawed upward. Flak blossoms erupted in black bursts. Shrapnel filled the air like invisible knives. Pilots gritted their teeth and pushed their sticks forward. "Stay steady! Stay steady! Drop!" Torpedo planes skimmed the waves, releasing their payloads just 900 yards from Yamato's side before pulling up hard, water spraying their canopies. Dive bombers screamed downward, bomb doors yawning open, releasing explosives that whistled through the smoke. Each man knew the risks. Some would never pull out. Some would be torn apart by flak or engulfed in fire. But the mission was larger than survival. The mission was Yamato. One Helldiver pilot later described the moment. You could see her gunners looking right at you. You weren't bombing a ship. You were staring down thousands of eyes, and every one of them wanted you dead. From below, Yamato answered with fury. Her 18-inch guns roared, not at ships, but at the sky, firing shells the size of cars into the heavens in desperate flak bursts. Her medium batteries chattered without pause. Her light guns stitched lines of tracers so dense they looked like glowing nets. American pilots said it felt like diving into a volcano. Smoke, fire, explosions, heat. Every instinct screamed to pull away, but they pressed in, closer, closer, until release. Several were hit. A torpedo plane cartwheeled into the sea, vanishing in spray. A Helldiver caught a burst of shrapnel, its wings sheared off before it slammed into Yamato's deck in flames. Sacrifice was not one-sided. Men on both sides were dying second by second. The true killers of the day were not the bombs. They were the torpedoes. American tacticians had learned from earlier battles. Bombs could crater decks, but only torpedoes could rip open a battleship's belly and unbalance her vast hull. So they attacked in waves, coordinated and merciless. Avengers came in low from port, then starboard, then aft, surrounding Yamato like wolves circling a stag. The first detonations shook the sea itself. Plumes of water erupted stories high. The ship lurched, then steadied, listing slightly. More torpedoes came, more explosions, more flooding. From the air, pilots could actually see the giant lean farther and farther. A behemoth brought to her knees by invisible holes punched beneath. The waves. One pilot radioed back. She's rolling, keep hitting her, boys. Hours into the attack, Yamato was a ruin. Smoke poured from her hull. Her deck was scarred with craters, her guns silenced one by one. Yet still, she refused to die quickly. Finally, the inevitable came. A torpedo struck near her forward magazines. The explosion that followed split the sea in two. Fire engulfed her bow, and then her heart detonated. From the air, American pilots saw the blast claw 3 miles into the sky. Even hardened veterans gasped. One described it as the biggest explosion I ever saw, like a volcano had erupted beneath the ocean. When the fireball cleared, Yamato was gone. Only oil and wreckage stained the water. For the men who had struck the blows, the emotions were mixed. Some felt elation. They had faced the enemy's mightiest warship and destroyed her in a single day. A victory to be remembered forever. Others felt something closer to sorrow. One pilot admitted, years later, "As we flew back, I looked down at the wreckage and thought, there were 3,000 men on that ship, and they all just died." They had not faced faceless machines. They had seen sailors running on deck, guns blazing, men fighting for their lives. Even in victory, the human cost pressed heavily on them. For the US Navy, Yamato's destruction proved what many already knew. The age of the battleship was over. The mightiest warship ever built had never fired a shot at an American vessel. She had been held down and drowned entirely by aircraft. Steel and size had meant nothing against wings and bombs. To naval strategists, it was confirmation. Carriers were the new kings of the sea. Battleships were relics. Yamato had not only died, she had marked the death of her entire kind. Yet even as smoke cleared over the East China Sea, the war ground on. For the American pilots, Yamato was just one mission. The next day they would launch again, striking Okinawa, covering Marines ashore, dueling kamikazes. There was no pause for reflection, only exhaustion, and perhaps, in the quiet moments, a memory of the colossal ship they had helped send to the bottom. To the Americans, Yamato was a monster slain, proof that no ship could stand against the air. But across the world, her sinking stirred something stranger. She would not be forgotten. She would become legend, reborn in stories, films, and memory. The East China Sea swallowed her whole. But Yamato did not die there. What vanished beneath the waves on April 7, 1945, was not only 72,000 tons of steel, nor the lives of nearly 3,000 sailors. It was an idea that battleships could decide the fate of nations, that steel and sacrifice could hold back the tide of history. And yet, in the silence that followed, Yamato grew larger than life. She became not just a ship, but a legend. In Tokyo, officials whispered the news in shame. Yamato, lost with nearly all hands. There was no grand announcement, no triumphant final communique. Only silence, broken by casualty lists. For the families who waited, silence was worse than truth. Mothers never received bodies to bury. Wives never saw coffins draped in flags. Survivors were sworn to secrecy, their voices smothered beneath military censorship. One sailor recalled, "We lived, but we were not allowed to exist. To speak of Yamato was to speak of defeat." But silence cannot last forever. Fishermen had seen the distant column of fire rising 6,000 feet into the sky. Survivors carried memories too heavy to bury. By war's end, everyone in Japan knew Yamato was gone. Her name was more than steel. Yamato was an ancient poetic name for Japan itself, a word steeped in history, song, and spirit. To say Yamato has fallen was, in a sense, to say Japan had fallen. To the government, she became propaganda, a martyr, sacrificed with honor for the homeland. Posters and speeches painted her as proof of Japan's unbreakable spirit. School children were told to remember her courage, not her failure. But beneath the surface, bitterness festered. Officers whispered what the people suspected. She had been wasted, sent on a one-way mission with no chance of success. A monument of pride turned into a tomb. One naval engineer admitted after the war, "We built her to protect Japan. Instead, we built her to burn." Yet Yamato cannot be reduced only to steel or strategy. Her legacy is human. Survivors staggered ashore in Kyushu, uniforms soaked with oil, eyes hollow. Villagers gave them rice, water, blankets. Some wept as they listened to fragments of story, the roar of explosions, the tilt of the decks, comrades sliding into the sea. One sailor recalled, "I saw her capsize. Men screamed as they fell into the waves. When I looked back, Yamato was gone." Another described the final blast. "It was as though the sky itself split open. Fire rained into the sea." For decades, many survivors could not speak of it. Some avoided reunions, ashamed to live while thousands had not. Others lit incense every April, their eyes wet with tears they never voiced. As the decades passed, memory hardened into legend. In Japan, Yamato became the tragic heroine of a nation's grief. Books and films painted her as noble sacrifice, the steel warrior who fought to the end. Poets invoked her as a metaphor for loyalty. And then, in the 1970s, Yamato was reborn in fantasy. Space Battleship Yamato, an anime series that launched in 1974, transformed the sunken warship into a starship, humanity's last ark, carrying hope across the stars. For a new generation, Yamato was no longer a tomb. She was inspiration, resilience, redemption. From tragedy, she had become myth. But the real Yamato remained, silent, broken. For decades, she was only memory. Fishermen spoke of strange echoes beneath their sonar. Survivors dreamed of her resting place. Then, in 1985, an expedition found her at last. Cameras descended into the dark and revealed what the survivors had described: a ship torn in two, her bow obliterated, her midsection ripped apart, her turrets flung from their mounts. The seabed was littered with debris, steel bones of a giant. Later surveys in 1999 and 2015 confirmed the scale of her ruin. Divers described the site as a cathedral, silent and sacred. One whispered, "You feel the presence of thousands of souls. It is not wreckage, it is a grave." For families, the discovery was bittersweet. They finally knew where their fathers and sons lay. Yamato was no longer just legend. She was a grave marked on the map of the sea. Naval historians too found lessons in her silence. Yamato was the pinnacle of battleship design, but also its obituary. She proved that no armor is thick enough, no gun large enough, when the sky belongs to the enemy. She was conceived in secrecy, built in defiance of treaties, designed for duels that never came. Her death marked the end of an age. After her, no nation would ever again build battleships so vast, so heavy with guns. The carrier had taken the throne, and Yamato's fall was its coronation. For some, she is remembered as pride, a marvel of engineering unmatched in size and power. For others, she is folly, a monument to wasted steel and wasted lives. Both are true. Yamato was magnificent. Yamato was futile. Yamato was pride. Yamato was grief. 70 years after her sinking, a diver said, "Standing before her wreck is like standing in a cathedral. The silence presses on you. You know thousands died here. It is sacred." Perhaps that is Yamato's final truth. She is no longer weapon nor propaganda. She is memory. Memory of courage, of tragedy, of sacrifice. The Pacific is quiet now. The waves roll endlessly over the place where Yamato sleeps. No fire, no thunder, only silence. But if you listen closely, in that silence, you can almost hear it still. The roar of her guns, the cries of her men, the heartbeat of a giant who refused to bow until the sea itself claimed her. Yamato is gone, but Yamato endures, not as steel, not as ship, but as story. And stories never sink. Before saying goodbye, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were there? And subscribe so you don't miss the next battle.